Imagine a city where everything was allowed. Unlimited luxury, endless parties, boundless wealth, a place where pleasure was the only rule and no one cared about the consequences. Sounds like paradise, doesn't it? But what if I told you that? This same city was destroyed in such a violent way that to this day, its name is synonymous with sin and abomination. Yes, I'm talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities that pushed every limit and paid the ultimate price for it. But was the story really as most people imagine? Were Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed only because of their immorality, or was there something much deeper behind their downfall? And more importantly, does the mentality of this city still exist today, disguised in new forms? What few people realize is that Sodom and Gomorrah were not just places of disobedience and corruption. They were centers of an arrogant society where prosperity and lust walked hand in hand. While the rich indulged in extravagant banquets and luxurious mansions, the poor were ignored, humiliated, and even exterminated. It was a system fueled by greed, where justice was bought and any sign of weakness was mercilessly crushed. Problem: they thought they were in control. They believed they could live without limits, without consequences, forever. But judgment came, and it came in a way no one could have imagined. The heavens opened to pour down fire and brimstone, erasing from the map two of the most depraved cities in history. And in the midst of it all, one family had the chance to escape. But not everyone managed to leave the past behind. So, what really happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? Why does this story still serve as a powerful warning for today? And what can we learn from the fall of these cities to avoid repeating the same mistakes? Get ready, because the truth about Sodom and Gomorrah is far more intense than you ever imagined. Before we continue, if you like our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, like and comment, even if it's just an amen. This makes a huge difference for this content to reach more people and impact lives. If you are not yet subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe, activate notifications, and share with those you love. Help spread this message of faith and hope. Each like, comment, and share strengthens this work, which we do with all affection to edify your life. Together we can reach even more hearts. Continuing. Sodom and Gomorrah were the epitome of extravagance. Their streets were a spectacle of wealth and power, filled with merchants displaying luxurious goods imported from Egypt and Mesopotamia. But anyone who looked beyond the golden facades would see something entirely different. A society given over to lust and corruption. The city never slept, and sin became more acceptable by the day, as if there were no consequences. Endless parties, unchecked indulgence, and a culture where everyone did whatever they pleased, without limits. Momentary pleasure was worth more than morality. At night, Sodom and Gomorrah transformed. The dark alleys concealed acts that few dared to speak of publicly, though everyone knew they happened. The laws, just ornaments for the rich who took full advantage of their prosperity without caring for the weak. The poor were ignored, treated as if they were invisible, while the powerful bathed in gold and arrogance. No one cared about justice. As long as their own desires were satisfied, everything was fine. It was a place where disobedience became a way of life. The natural order of things had been overturned, and fundamental values like compassion and righteousness had been abandoned. For many, this was progress. After all, they were prospering, right? Who cared if the means to that prosperity were questionable? Who cared if the city was drowning in abomination? The only thing that mattered was enjoying the present, without worrying about the consequences of tomorrow. Trade flourished, but not in an honest way. Greed ruled business, and wealth circulated only among those who knew how to manipulate the game. An unsuspecting foreigner who tried to negotiate fairly would quickly realize that there was no room for integrity here. It was all about survival, and the cleverest always won. Those who dared question the system were silenced or ridiculed. And what about the nights? If during the day Sodom and Gomorrah were a spectacle of grandeur and commerce, at night they were a den of debauchery. The parties began with banquets, overflowing with wine and lust, but soon turned into pure depravity. Sin was normalized, and lust dominated both bodies and minds. Nothing was forbidden, everything was allowed. What once shocked people had now become routine. And the most impressive part? Many believed they were living in the peak of freedom. But was it really freedom or just slavery disguised as pleasure? The more they indulged in immediate gratification, the more they lost their humanity. The city that never slept also never found rest for its soul. What seemed like happiness was nothing more than a smokescreen for the destruction that loomed ahead. However, something was about to happen. An unexpected visit, a warning ignored, and a destiny sealed. What the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't know was that their supposed invulnerability was about to crumble, and what came next would change history forever. The prosperity of Sodom and Gomorrah was evident to the naked eye. Merchants grew rich, selling rare spices, fine fabrics, and precious stones brought from distant lands. Trade flourished intensely, and the city's leaders flaunted unprecedented wealth. But this abundance was not shared. On the contrary, it fed a cruel inequality where the richest accumulated treasures while the poor were treated like dust on the ground. Gold could buy everything, even morality, and those in power believed they would never face consequences. Arrogance took root like a plague among the powerful. They saw prosperity as a sign of superiority and believed they were above any judgment. Who needed justice when wealth could buy any verdict? Who needed honesty when money opened all doors? The rich of Sodom walked with their heads held high, but not out of honor. It was pure pride, fueled by the belief that they controlled everything. They thought they could manipulate life like a chessboard, unaware that they were building their own downfall. The city's noble districts were a spectacle of luxury. Grand mansions bathed in gold, with lush gardens and crystal-clear fountains. Endless parties took place in these palaces, where guests paraded in expensive tunics adorned with jewels that would make any king envious. But just a few meters away beyond the walls separating the rich from the rest of the population, reality was entirely different. The poor were crowded in the streets, starving, ignored, and hopeless. In Sodom and Gomorrah, wealth and despair walked side by side, but only one side of the coin was seen and celebrated. Money also bought silence. Any voice raised against injustice was quickly silenced. Those who tried to help the needy were ridiculed, because the city's culture revolved around self-satisfaction. If someone couldn't sustain themselves, it was their own fault. Empathy, a non-existent concept. The prevailing thought was, every man for himself. If you have no wealth, you deserve nothing. And what about honesty? It was nothing more than a myth. Business was a pit of corruption, where contracts were broken, goods were tampered with, and betrayals were common. A simple deal could turn into a deadly trap if the buyer wasn't careful. In Sodom, trusting someone was a weakness. Everything revolved around profit and personal gain. The truth is that this unrestrained arrogance blinded the city to the imminent disaster. They believed their prosperity would last forever, that they were safe within their golden walls. But history teaches us that every civilization that gives itself over to arrogance and corruption is doomed to fall. They just didn't know that. This downfall was closer than they imagined. Sodom and Gomorrah were visually stunning. Their structures defied time, with imposing palaces, colossal temples, and bustling markets. Polished marble reflected the sunlight, and columns adorned with gold showcased the wealth of their inhabitants. It was impossible to deny. The city overflowed with luxury and grandeur. But behind this monumental architecture was a rotting system. The brilliance of the buildings couldn't hide the moral decay spreading through its streets like poison. During the day, the markets were the city's beating heart. Merchants shouted their offers, seducing customers with promises of exclusivity and prosperity. Silks from the East, priceless jewels, and exotic perfumes were traded at exorbitant prices. But anyone who thought they could buy something without being deceived was sorely mistaken. Corruption dominated business, and a single misstep could cost a man everything. In Sodom, there was no honesty in commerce, only cunning and greed. Religious. Temples were central to the city, but don't be fooled. Faith there was distorted. Pagan practices involved sacrifices and bizarre rituals where devotion mixed with depravity. Priests used their influence to justify the city's excesses, turning sin into something acceptable. Worshipping the local gods was the perfect excuse to indulge in lust and corruption. Many believed they were pleasing their deities when, in reality, they were only satisfying their own desires. And then came the night. The same squares and temples that during the day served as centers of commerce and religion, at night transformed into scenes of absolute debauchery. Parties took over the city, filled with drink, provocative dances, and immoral acts. Disobedience to the most basic moral codes was celebrated as a symbol of freedom. Anyone who dared to question or warn about the dangers of this lifestyle was ridiculed, or worse, banished from the city. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just cities of excess and luxury. They were also dens of corruption that rotted every layer of society. The justice system existed only in name, as the law was in the hands of the powerful. If a wealthy man committed a crime, all he had to do was bribe the judges, and it would disappear like smoke in the wind. But if a poor man dared to raise his voice or demand his rights, he was crushed without mercy. Justice was not blind here. It saw very clearly who had money and who did not. The courts were a farce. Any legal dispute between a rich man and a poor man had a verdict before it even began. The judges lived in palaces surrounded by gold and sold verdicts to the highest bidder. Likewise, commerce was a rigged game. Merchants openly deceived customers, and anyone who complained was expelled or even killed. If someone fell for a scam, the response was always the same: "You should have been smarter." The inequality was so absurd that the poor barely had the right to exist. There was no mercy for the needy. The starving died in the streets while the nobles indulged in excessive feasts. If a widow or orphan asked for help, they were shooed away like stray dogs. In Sodom and Gomorrah, the city's heart had hardened, and compassion was seen as weakness. Arrogance reigned over every corner like a disease that destroyed any trace of humanity. And what about foreigners? Their fate was even worse. Anyone arriving in Sodom expecting hospitality was met with contempt and hostility. Many travelers never returned home, vanishing without a trace. They were robbed, humiliated, and often killed for sport. Instead of hospitality, Sodom offered terror. Those who entered the city quickly realized they were at the mercy of people who had lost all sense of humanity. Greed controlled everything. For the rich, it was never enough. They always wanted more land, more slaves, more power. Prosperity was never shared because the idea of helping others simply did not exist. In Sodom, the only rule was self-interest. Anyone who tried to act justly was considered a fool and often eliminated. The wickedness was so deeply rooted that distinguishing right from wrong was impossible. If anyone dared to challenge the system, the punishment was brutal. There was no room for dissent. Those who opposed the corrupt leaders were ridiculed or condemned to brutal fates. Many times, dissidents simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. It was an environment where fear was the only weapon of control, and no one dared defy those at the top. But no civilization built on injustice can last forever. When corruption becomes the only law, destruction is inevitable. Judgment was near, and soon the city would feel the weight of its choices. Sodom and Gomorrah lived for pleasure. The truth, justice, and righteousness didn't matter, only immediate gratification did. Every night was a new opportunity to sink deeper into debauchery and depravity. The parties were endless, overflowing with exotic drinks, provocative dances, and rituals filled with lust. Sin was not just tolerated, it was celebrated as a way of life. In the society where everything was permitted, the line between right and wrong simply ceased to exist. Infidelity was so common that no one cared anymore. Marriages were not built on love or commitment, but on convenience and status. Betrayals were seen as normal, and maintaining a faithful relationship was considered naive. Men and women gave themselves to fleeting pleasures without thinking about the consequences, as if nothing could touch their supposed freedom. But what seemed like freedom was in fact a form of slavery. Addiction to pleasure kept them trapped in an endless cycle, always seeking something more intense, more extreme. The streets were filled with obscene displays, where bodies mingled without restraint. Sensuality was exhibited shamelessly, and any sense of decency seemed forgotten. Festivals promoted public orgies, and pagan temples became stages for degrading rituals. There was no space for reflection or moderation, only for excess upon excess. Anyone who did not participate was ridiculed, as if they were wasting the chance to truly live. But there was a price. Uncontrolled hedonism destroyed families, broke bonds, and above all, destroyed souls. People became empty, incapable of feeling anything genuine. Pleasure, which should have been something natural and healthy, became an unfillable void. It was a path of no return. The more they sought pleasure, the more they lost themselves. The city was saturated with a false joy that deep down hid a pain no one wanted to admit. And it wasn't just a moral issue, it was a matter of consequence. The social structures themselves began to collapse. Loyalty disappeared, trust was shattered, and relationships became superficial. Friendships were based on interest, and alliances were broken the moment they became inconvenient. Hedonism had corroded the city's core, turning it into a silent battlefield where everyone sought only their own satisfaction, without caring about anyone else. The city's leaders? They were the first to encourage this culture. After all, a people who live only for pleasure are easy to control. While the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah indulged in lust, the powerful took advantage of the situation to strengthen their rule. Hedonism was the perfect smokescreen to hide the corruption and decadence of the city. They believed they could live like this forever without paying the price. But every excess has a limit, and heaven's patience was running out. The warning had already been given, but who would be willing to listen? After all, why change when everything seemed so good? The problem is that destruction never announces when it arrives. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just cities of excess and corruption. They were also places where violence ruled unchecked. Respect for life had become an obsolete concept. Murders, brawls, and thefts happened in broad daylight, and no one seemed to care. Human life was worth less than a silver coin. The streets were dangerous, and anyone walking alone became an easy target. If you were weak, poor, or a foreigner, you had no chance of surviving without protection. The law of the strongest was the only rule. If someone wanted something, they simply took it. If a man desired another's property, he would claim it by force. If someone sought revenge for the smallest offense, there were no limits to what could be done. The entire city had become a battleground disguised as civilization. Mercy was non-existent, and compassion was considered a weakness. The arrogance of wealth and the corruption of the rulers only fueled this brutal mentality. Foreigners were the preferred victims. Any unsuspecting traveler who stepped into Sodom expecting hospitality was met with contempt and hostility. Many visitors never returned home, disappearing without a trace. They were robbed, humiliated, and often murdered for sport. Instead of welcoming outsiders, Sodom terrorized them. Those who entered the city quickly realized they were at the mercy of a people who had lost all sense of humanity. And what about the streets? They were infested with gangs and criminals who acted without fear. Thieves looted homes without concern, knowing there would be no punishment. Women were kidnapped, children were exploited, and any sign of weakness was seen as a death sentence. Justice? A joke. Brutal strength ruled, and those who did not conform to this system of chaos were quickly crushed. Violence wasn't just in the streets, it was inside homes, palaces, and even temples. Families were torn apart by cruelty. Fathers betrayed their sons. Brothers turned against each other, and trust became a luxury that no longer existed. The city had lost all sense of community. In Sodom, no one protected anyone. Everyone was on their own, and if a man died, the only reaction was indifference. The worst part was the normalization of brutality. The people no longer saw acts of violence as wrong. It was just a part of life. A murder in the public square did not cause horror, only momentary curiosity. A cry for help became background noise. Over time, people began to see cruelty as natural. The city had sunk so deep into darkness that it could no longer recognize the light. But no one can live like this forever without consequences. Every day, Sodom and Gomorrah dug their own graves a little deeper. The heavens had had enough, and judgment was closer than they realized. In Sodom and Gomorrah, being a woman or a child was almost a sentence of invisibility and suffering. There were no rights, no protection, no justice. Women were treated as property, mere objects in the hands of men. Their marriages were nothing more than commercial contracts, where their desires and opinions were ignored. They were sold, traded, discarded when they were no longer useful. If a woman dared to rebel against this system, her fate was humiliation, or worse, violence against women was constant and normalized. They had no voice, no choice. If a powerful man desired someone, he simply took her, and who would dare question him? The system existed to protect them, not to ensure justice. Wives were openly betrayed, and if they complained, they were accused of being ungrateful. Mothers watched helplessly as their daughters were handed over as commodities, powerless to stop it. The suffering of women was part of the culture, so normal that no one cared anymore, and the children, their fate was no better. From an early age, they learned they were nothing more than disposable pieces in the gears of Sodom. They were exploited, abused, and often sacrificed in pagan rituals that promised fortune and prosperity. Many were abandoned in the streets, left to die without anyone lifting a finger to help them. The concept of childhood simply didn't exist. Children were forced to face the brutality of the world from the moment they were born. The rich raised their children differently, but not better. In their luxurious mansions, they taught them that money was power and that empathy was weakness. Children grew up without values, without compassion, learning only how to manipulate and exploit others for their own benefit. If they showed signs of kindness or mercy, they were ridiculed. They grew up empty, corrupted by greed, before they even understood the meaning of life. The streets were full of forgotten orphans. Small beggars wandered the alleys, asking for food from people who pretended not to see them. Children starved, while the rich threw away entire feasts. The elites saw no problem with this. After all, they believed poverty was the fault of the poor themselves. This was the dominant mentality in Sodom. The weak deserved to be crushed. And if someone tried to help, they were seen as fools. Compassion was mocked, and any display of empathy was seen as weakness. In Sodom and Gomorrah, there was no room for kindness. Those who tried to change things were silenced, and those who needed help were ignored. But what happens when a society destroys its most vulnerable? The fate of Sodom and Gomorrah was sealed, and their downfall was imminent. They just didn't realize that the price of their arrogance was about to be collected. Sodom and Gomorrah believed they were invincible. Surrounded by wealth, protected by walls, and fueled by arrogance, their elites mocked any threat. To them, the city would never fall. They would continue living their lives of excess, accumulating fortune, and ignoring every warning. After all, who could stop them? Who would dare challenge such a prosperous people? But their fate had already been sealed, and destruction was on its way. They just didn't realize their time was running out. Lot, one of the few righteous men still living there, could feel the city's weight on his shoulders. He watched corruption grow daily, smelled the stench of moral decay in the air. But who would listen to him? His warnings were mocked. The entire city was blind, drunk on its own arrogance. No one believed judgment would come. They kept laughing, partying, and committing their sins without fear. But the warning had already been given. Then the angels arrived, messengers sent to rescue Lot and his family before it was too late. They entered the city and immediately saw Sodom for what it truly was, a den of corruption and violence. Barely had they arrived when they were surrounded by perverse men, hungry for new victims for their immoral practices. The city's heart was rotten, and the angels knew there was nothing left to be done. Sodom and Gomorrah had crossed the line. The decision was final. The judgment would be severe and without mercy. The command was clear. Lot and his family had to flee immediately without looking back. There was no more time. The destruction would not be partial. It would be absolute. The heavens themselves would open to pour down fire and brimstone, wiping these condemned cities off the map. Divine justice would not delay, and those who believed they were untouchable were about to learn how wrong they were. At dawn, while the city still slept under the false sense of security, everything changed. Flames began to fall from the sky like drops of molten sulfur. The fire spared no one, consuming houses, streets, and palaces in seconds. The screams of despair replaced the laughter, but now it was too late. The powerful, who once thought themselves gods, now ran like rats, trying to escape the inevitable. But there was no refuge. The destruction was complete. The temples were reduced to ashes, the markets collapsed, and the grand banquet halls became charred ruins. What once symbolized wealth and power was now nothing more than a cemetery of flames. Nothing remained. The city that prided itself on its freedom was now imprisoned under rubble and ash. Sodom and Gomorrah had ceased to exist. But the tragedy wasn't over yet. One last warning had been ignored. In the midst of the escape, someone looked back. And that mistake would cost dearly. The past had been condemned, and any attachment to it meant perishing along with it. But not everyone understood this. The command was simple: do not look back. Flee without hesitation, without regret, without longing for what was left behind. But not everyone could let go so easily. Lot's wife hesitated. For a brief moment, a thought crossed her mind. What about everything she was leaving behind? The home, the parties, the comfortable life, the familiar faces. Instinctively, she turned to look, and in that instant, her fate was sealed. What happened was immediate and irreversible. Her body stiffened, her feet rooted to the ground, and her skin transformed into a crystalline shell. In seconds, she was no longer a woman, but a monument to a mistake. There in the middle of nowhere stood the pillar of salt, a permanent reminder of what happens when someone clings to a condemned past. Her life was not consumed by Sodom's fire, but by her own inability to move forward. Why look back? What was left in Sodom that was worth holding on to? The city was a pit of corruption, arrogance, and sin, but the human heart is deceitful. Often, even knowing something is destructive, we still feel attached to it. It's the illusion of security, the false belief that the past was better than it really was. Lot's wife didn't just look at the city. She looked at her old identity, at the life she should have left behind. How many times do people do the same? They move forward, but with one foot still stuck in the past. They try to change, but carry regrets, memories, and old habits they refuse to abandon. The pillar of salt isn't just an ancient story. It's a symbol of what happens when we attach our hearts to what has already been destroyed. What happened to Lot's wife was not an arbitrary punishment, but a consequence of her own desire to remain in what no longer existed. And there she remained, motionless, while Lot and his daughters pressed forward into the unknown. They had no time for lamentation. The past had already been consumed by fire, and the future awaited ahead. Looking back meant losing the chance to start anew. Judgment had fallen upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and now only ashes remained, along with a solitary figure of salt, forever trapped in a moment of hesitation. Lot's wife could have chosen freedom, but she chose nostalgia. She could have embraced a new beginning, but she preferred to cling to what was lost, and in the end, she became part of the desolate landscape. Her story serves as a warning. When the time comes to leave something behind, do it without regret. Those who insist on carrying the past may end up petrified by it. And so ended Sodom and Gomorrah. No buildings, no gold, no parties, only a desert of ashes and a solitary pillar that to this day stands as a silent warning to those who dare to look back when they should be moving forward. And now, I ask you, how many Sodoms and Gomorrahs exist today? How many societies are so intoxicated by arrogance and sin that they believe they will never face consequences? Just like those who lived in these cities, do people still think that prosperity and wealth can protect them from everything? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just about the past, it is a chilling reflection of the present. A culture that normalizes corruption, injustice, and depravity is digging its own grave. The fall of these cities was not an isolated event. It was a warning. And the big question is, are we listening to this warning? Or are we like Lot's wife, looking back, clinging to a condemned way of life? What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us that no wealth, no influence, and no city is untouchable when judgment finally arrives. The issue was never just about pleasure or prosperity, but about the pride and disobedience that blinded those people to the truth. They had everything, but lost everything because they didn't know how to use what they had in the right way. And you? Are you allowing yourself to be influenced by a modern-day Sodom? Are you building your life on solid values, or are you following a path that in the end may lead to destruction? Because ultimately, there is always a moment of choice. There is always a warning before the fall, but few stop to listen. Now, I want to hear from you. Had you ever thought about this story this way? What stood out to you the most? Leave your comment below. And if you want to keep learning about the hidden truths of the Bible, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there is still so much more to be revealed.